welcome on behalf of the USC Price School of Public Policy, as well as my center at the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC Price. We have 1 hour today that we'll all be together in conversation, and we have a very distinguished set of experts, our panelists, our speakers today that will be joining us. So we're looking very much forward to the conversation. Just at the outset, I want to let you know what our agenda is in that quick hour. So we are going to start off with introductions in just a moment of that distinguished panel, and then transition into a pre-recorded interview with Senator Padilla and myself. And then we'll move into the actual panel session itself. And then that, of course, will be moderated by John Myers, the Sacramento Bureau Chief of the LA Times. And then we will have time near the end for Q&A from our audience, from all of you. I want to thank our USC communications team led by Katie Maloney, who has organized this for us today. We are not only on Zoom, but also live on Facebook streaming as well. So jumping in here with introductions. As I mentioned, our moderator today for the panel is John Myers, Sacramento Bureau Chief, LA Times. John has led the LA Times coverage of state government as Sacramento Bureau Chief since 2015. I can't believe it's been that long. He also writes a weekly newsletter of California politics and provides a regular news analysis. Prior to joining the Times, many of you might have seen him. He spent more than 20 years, 2 decades in radio and television news, much of that as an award-winning reporter covering Sacramento. He has served as a moderator of gubernatorial debates, has spent much of his career exploring ways to expand state house coverage through online blogs and also a California politics podcast. As a resident of the capital city, he holds degrees from Duke University and UC Berkeley. Thank you, John, very much for joining us today and serving as our moderator. Moving on, Dr. Rick Hasen is with us today. Professor Hasen is Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. He is co-director of the Fair Elections and Free Speech Center. We were all very happy to see that established recently. Hasen is a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation, writing as well in the areas of legislation, statutory interpretation, remedies, and torts. He is co-author of leading casebooks in election law and remedies. He served in 2020 as a CNN election law analyst. Professor Hasen was named one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America by the National Law Journal in 2013, and one of the top 100 lawyers in California in 2005 and 2016 by the Los Angeles and San Francisco Daily Journal. His op-eds and commentaries have appeared in many publications, including New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Politico, State. Dr. Hasen also writes the often quoted election law blog, which is a staple in our field, which the ABA Journal named its blog, spelled BLAWG, 100 Hall of Fame in 2015. The Green Bay recognized his 2018 book, The Justice, Contradictions, Antony Scalia, and Politics of Disruption for exemplary legal writing, and his 2016 book, Plutocrats United, received a Scripps Book Award honorable mention. His most recent book, forthcoming, Cheap Speech, How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics and How to Cure It, will be published in March of this year now, 2022, by Yale University Press. Dr. Hasen, thank you very much for joining us. All right, and Dr. Errol Southers is the director of Safe Communities Institute and Homegrown Violent Extremism Studies at the University of Southern California, USC, Sol Price School of Public Policy, one of my colleagues at USC, where he's also a professor of practice in government and management. Previously, Dr. Southers also served as California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's deputy director in the California Office of Homeland Security, Chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence for the Los Angeles World Airports Police Department, and President Barack Obama's first nominee for Assistant Secretary of the Transportation Security Administration. Before this, Dr. Southers was a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and also worked 7 years as a police officer with the Santa Monica Police Department, lecturing at Joint Chiefs of Staff anti-terrorism seminars, testifying before Congress on Homeland Security matters. Dr. Cesars also was recognized in Security Magazine's top 25 most influential industry thought leaders in the United States, and is a recipient of the Earl Warren Outstanding Public Service Award. He's the author of Homegrown Violent Extremism, a book investigating radicalization, recruitment, and ideological trends in domestic terrorism and extremism. And he's a co-chair of the USC Department of Public Safety Community Advisory Board. And he's also a member of the USA Today Board of Contributors, a senior fellow of UCLA School of Public Affairs, and a visiting fellow of the International Institute of Counterterrorism in Israel. Dr. Cesars, thank you very much for joining us. And certainly, last but not least, Stephen Spalding, we're very fortunate to have as well today. He is the Senior Counsel for Public Policy and Government Affairs at Common Cause, National Common Cause organization, Senior Advisor to the Common Cause President, Karen Hobart Flynn. And most recently, he served as a Senior Elections Counsel to the Committee on House Administration in the U.S. House of Representatives, which has jurisdiction over federal elections. As a senior aide to its chairwoman, he advised her and committee members on all matters of election law, including campaign finance, election administration, election security, voting rights, contested elections, oversight of Federal Election Commission, and the Election Assistance Commission. He played a key role in the House passage of H.R. 1, as well as bills that passed the House to combat foreign interference in elections, the SHIELD Act, the Strengthen Election Security, the SAFE Act, and address voting during the pandemic. And that was part of the elections component of the HEROES Act. He previously served as special counsel to FEC Chair and Commissioner Ann Revelle at the Federal Elections Commission. He advised her on enforcement actions, advisory opinions, and policy decisions, as well as management of the agency and public engagement. And he's held a number of very distinguished positions beyond that as well, or prior to that as well. Thank you, Stephen Spalding, very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mindy. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. I should have said that at the outset to everyone. We have such a serious and important topic to discuss, but we should also acknowledge Happy New Year and wish everyone a good 2022 as we keep our fingers crossed. All right, moving on to Senator Padilla. Senator Alex Padilla is the first Latino to represent California in the U.S. Senate. He was appointed in January 2021 to complete the Senate term, of course, of Vice President, Kamala Harris. The son of immigrants, Senator Padilla grew up in the San Fernando Valley and studied mechanical engineering at MIT. He was drawn to politics in response to California's anti-immigrant Proposition 187. Senator Padilla was elected to the LA City Council in 1999 and State Senate in 2006. And as California Secretary of State, just recently, he oversaw an historic expansion of voting rights and voter participation. He serves as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration, Citizenship, and Border Safety. He's a member of the Senate Committees on Budget, Environment, and Public Works, Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, Judiciary and Rules. And Senator Padilla lives in the San Fernando Valley with his wife, Angela, and their three sons, Roman, Alex, and Diego. Thank you, Senator Padilla, for joining us today for our conversation. 1 year after insurrection, how has our democracy changed?
Hi, Mindy, and thank you for having me today. 1 year out from the deadly insurrection of January 6th, there's more need than ever to strengthen our democratic process and protect voting rights. So in that spirit, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you again very much for joining us. So first question, as a former California Secretary of State, and now, of course, a U.S. Senator, what do you believe has been the most significant impact of the January 6th insurrection last year, particularly as it relates to the election and voting process in this country?
Free and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power are foundational promises of our democracy. When President Trump invited and incited a riot on January 6th, he attacked those promises. I think that January 6th was a wake-up call for millions of Americans to reckon with the harms of disinformation. We saw armed rioters brutally beating Capitol police officers. And the Confederate flag, the symbol of violent white supremacy, flew inside the Capitol for the first time in our nation's history. We saw how many individuals, including elected officials, chose loyalty to Trump over the truth. So the need for legislation to protect our democracy could not be clearer.
Thank you very much. Next question. Election reforms and voting rights are an extremely hot topic right now across the United States. What do you believe is the most beneficial, as you see it, election reform currently under consideration?
Well, right now, I'm pushing for Congress to pass the Freedom to Vote Act, which I'm co-leading in the Senate. This bill would mandate all states to implement reforms like automatic voter registration, same-day registration, expanded early voting, and vote by mail. As we've shown in California, these reforms help to increase participation and security in our elections. These reforms would help counteract the wave of voter suppression laws that we've seen proposed and passed by Republican legislatures since the 2020 elections, which most people thought were very successful. The measures in this bill have been used successfully in blue, red, and purple states, and I believe they should extend to every eligible voter in America. Now, I'm also a co-sponsor of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore much-needed protections against cynical and discriminatory attempts at voter suppression going forward. So yes, we need both the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
Thank you. Similarly, what, as you see it, is the most worrisome of election reforms currently being debated in this country, either at the state or federal level?
Well, the trend that worries me the most is the political and partisan interference in counting votes and certifying elections. For too many years, we've been fighting against voter ID laws, voter purges, and long lines at polling places. We now know, in the weeks leading up to January 6th, that President Trump and his allies were putting pressure on governors, state legislatures, secretaries of state, and local elections officials to alter their vote counts or their certifications. Now, we're seeing Republican state legislatures propose and pass bills that are designed to inject politics and partisanship into the process of election administration. These bills are an all-out attack against the very core of our democratic system.
Thank you. As a U.S. Senator, and with the power that comes with making policy at the federal level, what should be the role, do you think, of Congress in assuring elections across the board, across the United States, are free, fair, and accessible to all?
As a U.S. Senator, I believe that my job is to make voting easier for all eligible citizens. Voting is a fundamental right, and our democracy is strongest when everyone's voice is included. Since the first passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, we've recognized the critical role of the federal government in protecting that right to vote, especially for communities of color. The Voting Rights Act was reauthorized 4 times on a bipartisan basis, often on a nearly unanimous basis. So it's our job to reaffirm that legacy, because your right to vote, access to the ballot, should not depend on your zip code, your income, your race, or your political party. Now, I'm committed to keeping up the fight because future generations and our democracy demand it.
Thank you very much for all of your insights today, Senator. We know that you are incredibly busy, particularly right now during this period in our country. We're going to go ahead and let you go and appreciate very much your time again today. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on to our panel. Now, John Myers, Sacramento Bureau Chief, LA Times. Please go ahead and take it away. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Mindy, and hello to everyone. Happy New Year. Thanks for letting me be a part of this conversation. Important topic, huge topic to talk about, and 3 smart folks here who can offer some insights as to kind of where we are and where we go from here. As a reminder to everybody, we probably will have about a half an hour of conversation here, and then your questions will be welcome. And so I saw in the Q&A, people are already putting them in there. That's great. Get your little place in line. We'll try to kind of figure out how many we can get within the time frame we've got. There are a few things out of Senator Padilla's comments that I want to talk about with our panelists, but I want to start with the fundamental question that this event posed in inviting all of you to be a part of it, which is talking about our democracy and how it has changed since the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, which we are just, as you know, 2 days away from that 1 year mark. And so I'm curious, just as a introductory moment from our panelists, about how they see the changes in democracy. And we can talk, about mechanics, we can talk about voting, we can talk about information and disinformation, but the broader topic of our democracy and where it stands and the strength of our democracy, I'm curious to get our panelists to weigh in on. And if I can, Rick Hassan, just because you seem to be closest to me in my box on the little webinar, I'm going to pick on you first. What is your brief take? I mean, about where our democracy stands at this point as we come up to this 1 year mark?
Well, thanks for the question, John, and thanks to Mindy and to the Price School for having me today. I think our democracy is sick. We're in some trouble. When you think back to 2008, when George W. Bush finished his second term and handed power over to Barack Obama, we went from a conservative Republican to a liberal Democrat. Nobody was asking, we didn't see articles in the newspaper saying, will Bush leave office? Will there be a peaceful transition of power? I mean, if you wrote an article like that, you would have been laughed out of town because that's not the United States, right? But, what in the run up to 2020, given the rise of Trumpism, it was a real question as to whether or not we would have a peaceful transition. And I think it's only because of the courage of some people, especially Republican elected and election officials in places like Georgia and Arizona and elsewhere, that we did have a successful, peaceful transition, and we got lucky. And so I think we're in bad shape in that not only have we taken no steps to assure that we'd have a better election system come 2024, the next time we have a presidential election, we've actually reached a point where 2020 can be seen as a practice run for 2024. And all the things that didn't work in 2020, because, for example, we had people in positions of power who were willing to stand up for the rule of law and for democracy, we won't have those people in power to count the votes and to run our elections in 2024 in at least some places. And that makes me very concerned.
Let me go to Errol Southers, if I could, Dr. Southers. I mean, you come at this perspective from a government agency perspective and security issues, and that is at one of those very first level things we think about when we think about what happened almost a year ago. Where do you think we stand in terms, from your vantage point, of the democratic processes and ensuring those democratic processes?
Well, John, great question, and thank you for hosting today, and Mindy and the school. The Price School, I appreciate being here. First of all, I want to echo everything Richard just said and with regards to the concerns we should have. And as you mentioned, I come from a national and homeland security perspective. And I think going forward, we need to take a look backward. I teach in the Price School, and I have students in a graduate school that when 9/11 happened, they were in elementary school. They have no recollection of it. If we go back even further to the Oklahoma City bombing, if it weren't for the fact that we covered that in my class, they wouldn't even know what it was. But some interesting things have happened since then. And as Richard mentioned, if we talk about a society, there is no society without safety and security. We're at a time in our history now, or in our country, where basic security is being questioned, policing is being challenged. Many people don't know, but after Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, the Department of Justice set up a domestic terrorism executive committee. They were scheduled to meet on 9/11 in 2001. That meeting was canceled because of the attack that happened on that day that involved Al Qaeda. That committee didn't meet for another 13 years, and this country took its eye off the ball. And so here we are now with a threat that's been metastasizing over the last 2 decades, and a country that's involved in anti-government activities, exacerbated by COVID and having to stay at home, where conspiracy theories it really grew. And the level of misinformation online, because again, we're all at home. So we have a country here now where we are really challenged with basic security, safety, and public safety because of the environment that we're all in. And I'm very, very concerned about this. And I agree with Richard. We could be looking at what was a practice run last year for what could happen, not just 4 years from now, but even at the midterms. And I think my colleagues in the national homeland security domain would say the same thing.
Stephen Spalding, your thoughts here. I mean, you've seen it both, looking at your background from inside government and outside now as an advocate in the advocacy world. Where do you see this topic as we sit this moment?
Really, there's been such a decay and an erosion of public trust and confidence in the strength of our democracy. Recent polling just yesterday came out. I believe it was an NPR poll that showed that 64% of Americans believe that, quote, democracy is in crisis and at risk of failing. And 2/3 of Republicans agreed with the false claim that, quote, voter fraud helped Joe Biden win the popular vote. We're at a point now where about less than half of Republicans said they would accept the results of the 2020 election. So the way that big lie really, again, to use the word that Mr. Suthers used, metastasized, I think, and supercharged on January 6th, echoed in social media. It went viral, and it infected state houses, and it infected the laws and election administration. People may have heard the numbers. 19 states passed 34 votes that actually restrict access to voting, and there were roughly 440 that were introduced. This in a year, last year, 2021, after a record number of voters showed up in 2020, in spite of the deadly pandemic, to cast their votes. The backlash has been to make it harder to vote in many states, and in particular, making it harder for underrepresented populations that have traditionally been kept away from a seat at the table. Black Americans, Brown Americans, Asian Americans, disabled voters. A number of these laws will make it harder, in particular, for all Americans, and those Americans in particular, to make their voices heard at the ballot box. Specifically, the sorts of cutbacks that we saw at the state level, many went after voting by mail, shortening the window to apply for a mail ballot, shortening the deadline to return a ballot, making it harder to remain on vote by mail lists. Of course, famously in Georgia, a state that President Biden carried and that sent 2 Democratic senators to Washington, making it a crime to provide food and water. So the big lie on January 6th has resulted in these laws that, unfortunately, I believe will continue to be a focus of activity as state legislative sessions come into session this month, and something that Americans, I think, increasingly should be concerned about, and just further puts the onus on Congress. We know the House has acted. It passed strong voting rights legislation, the For the People Act, the precursor to the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the Protecting Our Democracy Act. Of course, all of these are held up in the Senate. We may see some action this month, but it just puts the onus on Congress to really set fair national standards for the freedom to vote.
Let me stay on you if I can, Stephen, because you kind of got to exactly where I was going to go with you, which when we look at what Congress is considering, because Senator Padilla talked a lot about legislation, obviously from his vantage point in the Senate. What's at the top of that list? I know there's no silver bullet. I'm not naive to this, but what's at the top of that list that you think Congress should move on first? What's the first thing? And then I'm going to go to a couple of others about kind of where we go from here. But what do you think's at the top?
Well, the bills that are teed up, again, just a real quick refresh on the process to get to this point. The House twice, actually it was 3 years ago today, that the House originally introduced H.R. 1, passed the House twice, passed in March of 2021, most recently, moved over to the Senate, where through conversations with Senator Joe Manchin, there was a compromise bill, the Freedom to Vote Act, which is, just real quick, a very comprehensive bill that is setting national standards. It's not about micromanaging or taking over state election administration. What it is setting a floor and basic national standards, which the Constitution grants Congress the authority to do in Article 1, Section 4. States set the time, place, and manner of elections, but Congress may at any time alter such regulations or make new regulations. So these national standards around vote by mail, as we saw in the pandemic, I think voters became intimately familiar with, if you lived on one side of the river, you might have to get your vote by mail ballot postmarked 2 days before election day. And in another state, you had until the close of polls to get it to a drop box. And it gave the Postal Service time to deliver that to election officials. So the first pillar of the Freedom to Vote Act, setting those national standards around things like automatic voter registration, which could bring up to 50 million new voters onto the rolls. Fair national standards around vote by mail, ensuring that your ballot is provided, for example, on paper, so that we have paper ballots, which is the gold standard of ensuring and bolstering confidence in elections. Things like ending gerrymandering, which is in the bill, setting fair national standards around redistricting to prohibit partisan and racial gerrymandering. Those reforms, I think, are really critical to ensuring that every voter has the chance to cast their ballot. And co-equal is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, a bill that would repair the damage that the Supreme Court did in the Shelby County decision in 2013, when it essentially canceled out the formula to determine what states would have to have new states with a history of racial discrimination in voting would need to have their laws reviewed and approved, and also responding to last summer's decision, the Bronovich decision. And just one more important point, because the bill, certainly the threat of election sabotage and election subversion has also metastasized. I think it's 1 in 3 election workers fear harassment in their polling place. We've seen attacks at the local level. The Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act have very important election subversion provisions to prohibit, for example, the removal of nonpartisan election officials and granting them an opportunity to challenge their removal, to protect election workers at the state level. And then we know that reforms to the Electoral Count Act also important, something that I expect the January 6th Select Committee to be taking a close look at. But that law would deal with the scoreboard. We have to deal with the rules of the game, and that is unfortunately being in large part manipulated by partisan actors at the state level. And so setting those fair national standards in the Freedom to Vote Act, in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, I think are critical. But Congress has to walk and chew gum at the same time. And there is no single solution. It's going to have to be comprehensive.
And Rick Hassan, you had a thought on this. You messaged me to say.
So I have I think a somewhat different take than Stephen on what needs to happen to deal with the risks that we're talking about in this panel. I certainly think that questions of voter suppression are serious ones. I've written a couple of books about that, so I don't mean to discount that. And I'm a supporter of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and I like pieces of the Freedom to Vote Act. But I think that, those bills are not primarily aimed at the risk of election subversion. And what I mean by election subversion is the risk that the election loser will be declared the election winner, or we won't be able to tell who's won an election. I mean, that's a really very basic, even worse than voter suppression, is not having a fair counting of the votes. And I think that needs to be a priority. And I think that Democrats and Republicans both have failed us, we the people, the voters of the United States, in not moving forward on a package right after Biden came into office, January 20th, to deal specifically with the problem of subversion. There are pieces of the Freedom to Vote Act. For example, there's a part of the Freedom to Vote Act that requires everyone vote on ballots that produce a piece of paper. I think that's crucial. But if you're making a list, say, of the top 5 things that need to be done to go after election subversion, it wouldn't be things like dealing with partisan gerrymandering or having better campaign finance disclosure laws. I mean, these are things that I support, but I don't think it's the priority at this moment right now. And given the political realities, which is that, first of all, Democrats don't have, the votes among Republicans to get any of this passed. So they'd have to blow up the filibuster, and they don't have the support of all of their members to blow up the filibuster.
Right.
It seems that something more pinpointed at the risk of election subversion at least has the chance of attracting some bipartisan support. And of course, the last point I'll make is if Democrats go it alone and, for example, push through changes to the Electoral Count Act or other laws without any Republican buy-in, it's not clear that this is going to bind anyone who is trying to subvert election outcomes. A law is only as powerful as people's willingness to obey it and the ability to enforce it.
Yeah.
And so we kind of have to think more broadly, I think, about these kinds of problems.
Stephen, one thought back, and then I'm going to go to Errol Southers for another topic, but go ahead, Stephen.
I share certainly the concerns about how votes, once they're cast, are actually counted. But I don't think we have to choose between the two. I think clearly reforms to protect the counting of ballots, the Electoral Count Act, it's critically important, it's necessary, but it's insufficient to meet the ongoing coordinated assault on the freedom to vote that just happened last year, that will happen this year. Those bills are pre-filed, they are teed up. So I really think it has to be both. It shouldn't be a choice between the two. And as for the filibuster, there are literally right now ongoing conversations about repairing and restoring the Senate in a way that ensures that there is robust debate, but ultimately there can be final action. And I think that conversation will really be intense over the next couple of weeks here in DC.
Errol, I wanted to bring you in because something came to mind as we were having this discussion, which is, because your expertise comes in a lot of security issues, we don't think of voting security when we think of national security historically. That's not what we have thought about. We need to rethink that in some ways. And I've asked Stephen here, and Rick has chimed in, about legislation and things that can happen and substantive changes. Have you thought at all about that? Because again, it is striking to me that we never thought, you painted a very powerful picture of 9/11, but this is an attack on democracy in a different way that we never contemplated as young people.
John, it's a great question. And to your point, the threat on the voting process is both kinetic and, if you will, virtual. So if we look about the kinetic threat, one of the things we were challenged with in the last election were quote unquote poll watchers who were going to show up and intimidate people, as a practice that is unfortunately taking place in our country over many, many years. So that is something that I think we need to deal with. I'm really looking at this whole issue of voting from a violence prevention standard. Of course, there's information that goes out to, if you will, deters people from voting, misinformation, telling them the wrong date, telling them the wrong polling location. I'm concerned about people who are afraid to go and vote. We now have people who are refusing to work in the polls because of the threats they're receiving. The number of threats has incredibly increased since the last election. And if you recall, we've had threats in the past of governors who were targeted, both in Michigan and Virginia. So one of the things I'd like to have America think about as we go forward is, polarized and partisan as this is, a threat is a threat. And domestic terrorism is direct domestic terrorism. And we need a more fact-based, evidence-based, if you will, analysis to shape policy and to shape the legislation that Stephen's talking about as we go forward. There's a famous data scientist named W. Edwards Deming. He used to say, without data, you're just somebody with an opinion. Well, we have tons of data to show that the threat is real. We don't need a new domestic terrorism statute. United States Code Title 18 has all the ammunition we need to go after people who are, in fact, domestic terrorists. And I can't tell you how much the FBI's caseload has increased in the last 24 to 36 months. So one of the things that I'm really delighted about, and I talked previously about the Domestic Terrorism Executive Committee, which didn't meet for 13 years, and then it met every quarter for the last 2 years of the Obama administration. The previous administration removed the focus from right-wing extremism. And again, let's talk about an organization, the FBI, that's supposedly focused on not the ideology, but the threat itself. 3 months after Merrick Garland was sworn in, he wrote the nation's first strategy for countering domestic terrorism. And that is something that should lead the way. I think that one of the things that has to happen is that we need to have the Office of Director of National Intelligence involved in a comprehensive threat assessment across the country. And we need to build our National Security Council capacity to counter extremism and disrupt these networks. We are at a real real interesting pivot point here with regards to how bad this is going to get. And the fact that we have a January 6th committee that's trying to investigate an insurrection should be a clue, we would call it in police work, with regards to how bad this is and what we need to do.
A clue, a fairly large clue, I guess. I want to remind the folks who are watching that we're going to get to your questions in a moment, and I can already see from the Q&A there are a whole lots of questions. So just be mindful. We'll get to as many as we can in the time that we've got allotted. But where we are in this conversation now wants me to get to the disinformation and the social media and the big tech questions that we have to talk about, because there are enforcement issues, there are legal issues, there are cultural issues at stake here. And so as you approach that place where disinformation has festered, I mean, I can't think of no other better way to describe it than that. What should we be looking for? And I'm going to throw this to anybody here. So this is kind of the danger of a webinar. All of you start talking at once, but like, what should we be looking for? Where is your focus when we look at the role and responsibility of tech companies and users of technology and social media and the government? It's that kind of really very complicated place. I got three smart guys here. What do you think?
I have a book coming out on this topic, as Mindy mentioned at the top, called Cheap Speech. And as with the problem of election subversion, I think that some of the solutions are legal. And some of the solutions are going to be political. So on the legal side, I think that Congress should pass a law, and states could pass the same kind of laws, making it illegal to lie about when, where, and how people vote. This kind of law preventing deception, I think, would be constitutional under the First Amendment. I'm happy to get into the details if you have questions about that. Unlike a law, for example, that would make lying about, say, an opponent's position on taxes, I think that would probably be unconstitutional. But about the mechanics of voting, I think that it's certainly possible to pass such a law. The problem with that approach, and the problem with using other legal methods like defamation law, as we've seen, to go after some of the lies of 2020 about election machines stealing votes, is that it only deals with part of the problem. And it's very hard to come up with laws that would satisfy the First Amendment and that would be workable, that could actually deal with this problem. There was just reporting today from the Washington Post and ProPublica about Facebook groups and tens of thousands of messages calling into question legitimacy of the election, threatening violence, calling for overthrow of the government. There was an FBI agent who testified to Congress, and I quote in the book, saying, it's very hard to know where advocacy ends and the line when you've crossed into illegal conduct to try and overthrow a government begins. And so much of this has to be pressure on social media companies. Social media companies remove content all the time. It's why our feeds are not filled with pornography and other things that people would find very objectionable. This kind of conduct, this kind of content needs to be removed. I think Facebook and Twitter did a terrible job dealing with Donald Trump's election lies and his attempts to foment unrest. It was only on January 6th that he was actually removed. It should have happened much earlier. There should be a very high bar to remove a politician from a social media platform, but he clearly crossed it. So I think some of it's law, but a lot of it is going to be pressure from people. And if we can't pressure Facebook to fix it, then that says we need an antitrust solution to deal with Facebook.
Stephen and Errol, could you weigh in on this as well? And then we'll go to some questions from our audience. First, Stephen, if you're...
I completely agree with Professor Hassan. I just would point out the Deceptive Practices and Voter Intimidation Prevention Act, which would get at lies that are spread online about the time, place, or manner of voting, has been incorporated in the Freedom to Vote Act, and it was also in some other pieces of legislation. But more specifically, I mean, as Professor Hassan just talked about, the Washington Post ProPublica report today, literally 10,000 posts a day on Facebook groups between Election Day and January 6th, attacking the integrity of the election and calling for political violence went public. Why do we know about it? Because researchers and those journalists depended on third-party sources for that information. So even before getting into a legislative or legal solution, what steps can social media companies take to make sure that this data is transparent and accessible to researchers? Back in August, for example, Facebook removed access of an NYU researcher who was looking into how Facebook what role did Facebook play specifically with January 6th. And so beyond that, looking at algorithmic amplification. Facebook decides the rules of its platform. What the platform recommends or shows to you, as Professor Hassan says, it has the tools to demote and deprioritize that content. Ultimately, platforms have proven, though, they cannot regulate themselves to effectively combat disinformation. So while we continue to push for federal legislation, it is going to take, I think, social pressure. And one other point that I just would recommend that I think has been just a resource, especially as we look back at January 6th, my former boss, Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, put together thousands of posts, thousands of pages of social media posts that members of Congress put out, really questioning the integrity of the 2020 presidential election. And so when it comes to holding our own public officials accountable for the disinformation that they sowed, using that resource and seeing those materials and seeing it all up close, just again, I think is a really important resource as we look back and as the Select Committee continues its efforts to share with the American people the truth of what happened.
Yeah. Errol, any thoughts before I go to our questions?
Well, I just echo what Stephen just mentioned, but I would say if we have a situation, and I really want to point to what he said with regards to organizations policing themselves. We all know that organizations who investigate themselves rarely find anything wrong. So I'll just say that there are no consequences for their actions. There's no consequences when they don't act. The European Union has taken some really interesting steps with regards to the platforms they have over there, with excessive fines and even removing platforms from the web. There is not a real difficult challenge when you talk to an average person about what's reasonable, and then in my world, what might actually be deemed probable cause. We know what a threat is. And unfortunately now, we're not taking that very seriously. You don't have to go to the dark web or to some 8chan, 4chan, Pastebin, some offline site to find the threats that are there. And these companies are not only ignoring them, but promoting them. So as long as we have this online capability, which has just, again, been on steroids for the last 5 to 10 years, with no consequences, this is only going to get worse. And we really need more than a legislative action. We need a more resilient community who understands what misinformation is, makes for a more robust society and a safer community. And that's what we need to do, is educate people and make them more aware.
So we've got some good questions from folks who are watching. They're going to make my job awfully easy now, because then I just kind of get to weave us through some of them. And thanks to Katie Maloney at USC, who is kind of going through some of these and giving them to us. And again, apologies, folks. We won't get to all of them, but I'm sure there are email addresses and ways to get in contact with our panelists after the fact. But one of the first ones that came across was this idea of we're going to get really kind of into the nitty gritty about how elections are run and open source election systems. We've talked about that a lot in this country. And so the question was, could we talk a little bit about them and how we might build trust and transparency by using them? I think that's the questioner's point here, is that would help there. What do we think about the state of open source? There are some places that do it more than others. It's still kind of the unusual flavor of elections here in California. We have a lot of for-profit companies that still provide a lot of the equipment. Stephen, is that something maybe I could ask you about, where you think we are on open source technology and voting these days? And others can join in if they want, but can I start with you?
I know that there's certainly been some real innovation around open source, I think particularly actually in California. I would just take a step back and pivot a little bit more to while we are in the system that we're in right now, with actually 3 voting machine vendors essentially cornering roughly 90% of the market. What we need are strong accountability mechanisms for these vendors, transparency behind how these vendors operate, transparency into the systems that are used in election administration. And so that is, again, not to sound like a broken record, it is a piece of federal legislation, not just the Freedom to Vote Act, but it's been included in the SAFE Act and in other pieces of legislation around increasing vendor accountability. Because in part, of course, not to get really into the nitty gritty, but just taxpayer dollars are paying for these systems. It's a very opaque industry. I would encourage viewers to take a look back in January 2020, right before the pandemic really exploded. The House of Representatives, House Administration Committee really held the first ever oversight hearing of election vendors. And you had the three major system CEOs there taking questions from members of Congress, and that record is available. But I think I can't speak to the specifics about open source, although I know there are incredible benefits. But ultimately, right now, given where we are, the system, the vendor accountability is really critical.
Let me interject my moderator's privilege here to kind of take something that I thought about open source. We have long said that that a strength of American elections is that we have all these separate elections, right? In California, I'm going to do the Russian nesting dolls analogy. Forgive me. In California, I always say, well, we don't have a California election. We have 58 elections because they're done in the counties. Across the country, we say we don't have one election. We have 50 elections because they're done in the states. But the era we're living in suggests some dangers to that. Are the dangers great enough to think about a nationalized kind of system process, or is that still too dangerous because of all the reasons that's been knocked before? I don't know where I should go with this first. I'm looking at the eyes. Boy, nobody's eyes really feel. Oh, maybe Rick's eyes feel like it. But this is a conversation topic we've had in the past as a strength, and I wonder if you think it still is, or perhaps it's a weakness.
I think that it's a tough question because there are pluses and minuses, right? So you can imagine a national election system, if it's not truly independent of the executive. What if you have a chief executive, a president, who tries to manipulate the election process on the national level, right? Something, again, we think would be unthinkable in this country, but is quite thinkable now. Alternatively, when you have things hyper decentralized, as we do in the United States, we had a problem recently where a local election official in Colorado gave away software, proprietary software information about voting technology to Mike Lindell, the MyPillow guy, who's one of the leading conspiracy theorists about elections. And the release of this information made election systems vulnerable across the United States. Anyone who uses these kind of voting machines. You can't really have an open source system unless your software is designed so that it's really unhackable for elections. So I think I'm not a technologist, so I can't speak to the details of this, but I do think there are costs associated with full transparency as well, and that transparency is not an unalloyed good, and localism or centralization is not. You have to kind of weigh the risks and benefits across both dimensions.
Errol, is there either a benefit or a danger from a security perspective in having a more nationalized system? Either helps you address the problem or everything goes down at once?
Whenever I think of obviously decentralizing things does make it somewhat more efficient normally. When I think of elections, I don't think that way. I think that it's really embarrassing that there are third world countries who have more efficient elections than we do. I think that this might be a time to really look at a nationalized system. I think it's a way to perhaps collect the data more quickly, to analyze it more quickly, and to make sure it's all comprehensive with regards to the security measures that are in place. 50 different states holding elections, meaning 50 different states have security protocols that are all different. Not to say one is better than the other, but they're all different. And so that's why we wind up with a situation like we had in this past election, where states are challenging how good it was. So this is a time where I would suggest that centralization might be a better remedy, and federalization might be a better remedy with regards to election security, because then we have one system, one process. Other countries seem to be able to do it, and why can't we?
Also going to use my moderator's prerogative to make an observation on this point too, because I talk to election officials so often, especially on the local level. So I'm going to make the pitch they would normally make. There are lots of things they could do if we funded elections better in this country, both in California and around the country. Especially here in California, we see lots of mandates on how to run the elections without any money to actually conduct that. And so that seems to always be an issue. So one of our questioners asked something that's kind of interesting here that I'm going to throw open. And again, forgive me, just guess we could do the real raised hand function, but Rick was so good when he put his hand up. I like that. Do you believe the disinformation environment surrounding the insurrection, this person asks, do you believe it would have been as impactful if it worked for the pandemic with people spending more time at home and online, and that their lives becoming really virtual? Do you believe there's an element to that the pandemic was a perfect storm? Yes, sir, Errol. Thank you for the hand.
I often say the pandemic was an incubator for the problem that we have now. You have a very interesting, diverse collection of extremist groups and organizations and ideologies that essentially coalesced under the banner of COVID. When we saw people that were taking on state houses, in some instances armed, across the country, they were all there because they didn't like the government, didn't like to have to stay at home, didn't want to wear a mask, believe conspiracy theories, but they might not have all been at the same rally had it not been for the fact that they had COVID as the umbrella. So I do believe that it coalesced a lot of challenges, and it's really exacerbated the situation that we have now.
This is a question, and again, we're just kind of getting on the home stretch here of our conversation. One question that came in that I thought might, it plays off of what we talked earlier about social media. This viewer asked that they heard the panelists mention social media companies need to take a stronger role in removing content without changing the existing laws. But this person asked, if that happens, do you think the content just moves to other platforms other than Facebook and Twitter, and platforms that choose not to apply the same standards, that they'll just let it go there? I mean, it's kind of the, squeezing the air through the balloon kind of idea. Rick, you want to say something?
Yeah. So one thing is that one of the reasons these platforms work well is because they're networked, because they're very large. You can reach lots and lots of people. And so we've already seen a kind of hiving away of people going to Parler, going to Getter, going to Gab. These are right-wing sites that are alternatives to Twitter. And again, it's a trade-off. On the one hand, you might radicalize a smaller number of people, right? But on the other hand, it's a smaller number of people, so that's better. So, let me put it bluntly, I don't think we would have had the events of January 6th had we not been in the social media environment that we're in right now. If we had the polarization of today, but the technology of the 1950s, I don't think that we would have had the relentless repeating of the lies about the election. Channels 2, 4, and 7 and the local newspaper and the New York Times wouldn't have covered it, and that would have been the end of it. So, there's a kind of echo chamber and viral incubator, I think was the term that Errol used. I mean, that's exactly the problem that we have on these larger platforms. I think it's better if it moves to smaller platforms.
Let me ask, Stephen, can you give me and I apologize to ask you for a kind of a lightning round question. This is me playing like moderator at a gubernatorial debate, but like a lightning round thing here. A group like Common Cause, your advocacy is both at government and at the public. What can we do to have this conversation with the public, not just elected officials?
Certainly conversations like this are essential. So more public forums, and the kind of best of times, worst of times of the pandemic has made this kind of interconnection, these kinds of dialogues, which, by the way, I believe is being broadcast on Facebook that can be shared, an opportunity to really educate the public. But maybe getting a little more nitty gritty. I mean, you can tweet at your elected officials. You can write letters to the editor. Those kinds of things attract the attention of the public, of public officials. So there's a whole, I think, bevy of advocacy tools that we can use. Connect with local organizations on the ground. Common Cause, we've got 1.5 million members throughout the country, a number of robust state offices, including a big presence in California. So engaging at the local level. And if I take one more step back, really investing in local media. I mean, that's been so hollowed out over the past roughly decade, which has created this vacuum for disinformation to flourish. And so adding into, whenever you're at a town hall, talking about how we can strengthen local media, independent media is also very essential.
And let's go in this order, because this will be kind of where we turn it back to Mindy. Errol, and then if I could, Rick. Similar kind of question, same place that Stephen's on, because someone asked us this question too, and I think we should absolutely address it. What can concerned citizens do? What can you do both to support elected officials or, have your voice heard and change the system? Errol, if you could, and then we'll go to Rick.
Concerned citizens need to, again, just educate themselves with regards to who's running, what their platforms are, become more aware of these challenges, get outside the bubble, support your local elections. And what Stephen had mentioned previously, engage in your local media. I think that we need to do more of that. I work with a couple of journalists here in Los Angeles, and they're great people. They know what's going on. And much like the law enforcement community in your town that knows what's going on, so do the journalists. So I would read what they write.
Well, I'm never going to say no to that, of course. But Rick Hasson, you can take us home on this.
I would just add that because our elections are so hyper decentralized, it means that there's room for action on the local level. You should know who your local election administrator is. Orange County is losing a great election administrator, Neil Kelly. Be involved in the process of trying to influence who his successor is. Make sure it's somebody with integrity. I mean, this is something that we can all do on our local level. And of course, we have to worry about other places too. But good election administration starts at home.
If anyone from Facebook is listening, this is so simple. But those verified blue checks, if Facebook, Twitter would just verify local election administration officials, that would be one more layer of getting the truth out. And so people can identify who those local people are.
And as I get ready to hand this baton back to Mindy, I will just say, from my vantage point to this question or two, if I can, people have to really source their information better. That's obviously a place where we do our work at the Times and at other news organizations. We try to double source it, triple source it. People just need, and I tell my parents this all the time. This is a great conversation with my mother. Source your information before you share that on Facebook. Think about where you got it from. Question it. Don't be in your echo chamber. But that, I think, is somewhat of an indirect support to the elections process as we try to kind of get away from where we were 1 year ago today, this week. Rick Hasson, Stephen Spaulding, Errol Southers, been fantastic. I'm going to be quiet now. The one and only Mindy Romero. Thank you so much to everyone for letting us have this conversation. Really, really fascinating.
And thank you to John Myers, the one and only John Myers. We're very fortunate to have you for our moderator today. As we close out, I also need to thank, of course, our USC communications team led by Katie Maloney, for putting all of this together again, for all the work that's been done to make this event happen. Some of you who are with us today might recall that last year, just the day after the insurrection, January 7th, 2021, we had a previously planned webinar to talk about polarization in the US and how to move beyond that. And we were sadly faced with, the morning after talking about the events of January 6th. And so we've taken it now forward to talk about where we're at 1 year later. And I think it's clear that with the conversation we've had today, that not only, I hope for everybody, it was interesting, it was informative, but clearly there's much work to be done, right? This was not a historical lesson today to talk about what happened a year ago. It was a conversation to talk about where we're at, clearly the factors that led into January 6th, the impact of January 6th, and all of the work legally, politically, and at a societal level. And I hope you all feel that you've received some tools today to be able to do the work yourselves as individuals and whatever roles you play in this field. So on that note, this video will be available on the Price website. We'll be tweeting it out, putting it on Facebook, all of that. Put it on my center's website, Center for Inclusive Democracy. So hopefully one step you can take is to share this. If you found this a useful conversation, please share it widely. It's an hour, short and sweet, and hopefully helpful to all those that you might share it with. So thank you again, panelists, Errol, Rick, and Stephen, for all of your expertise. And of course, we want to thank, last but not least, Senator Padilla, who joined us as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day and Happy New Year.